impairment, because some people choose to drive when it's not safe for them to drive because they're impaired to a greater extent. We have rules around the requirement for humans to ensure that their vehicles remain safe, because not everyone will ensure that's the case. And we have rules around how heavy vehicles can be, because some people will choose to overload them. But imagine a world where you can't do any of that. The vehicle won't move if it's got a fault. The vehicle won't speed. It won't matter if you've had too many drinks, because you won't be in control of the vehicle. If the vehicle is overweight, it won't move. All of these things start to really question, how would you design a regulatory system for that environment? You know, imagine a world where all those things happen. You don't need enforcement either. We spend $300 million a year on your behalf to fund the police to do enforcement. You wouldn't need that anymore. So the interesting thing about this is that, for me at least, challenges us to think very differently about the regulatory system. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. For local government, for the network owners, for NZTA, for local government as well, I think it raises also potentially some very serious questions around their role. And I think what we'll see in transportation is something akin to what we've seen occur in telecommunications. You know, 20 years ago, if you owned the copper wire, you thought you had a license to print money, right? Not anymore. Owning the network may not be quite what it is today in 20 years' time, because actually connected vehicles and a whole bunch of smart people will develop platforms and services that actually start to actually manage the networks and optimize your journey time without relying on someone else controlling those things with traffic lights and so on. You won't need traffic lights anymore, because the vehicles will manage these things themselves much more optimally than someone sitting in a control room can. So there's some really interesting questions about what happens. I think, you know, I remember taking my kids a few years ago when I first came into this role to Motat in Auckland, and they had the old Ministry of Transport patrol car with the red cherries and black and whites. And my kids were not old enough to remember those, right? I said, you know, in the good old days, those were the company cars at the MOT, you know. Well, one day they'll go to Motat and see, you know, my grandchildren will see traffic lights, and I'll say, you know, we used to have these on intersections all over the place. Not anymore. So there's a whole bunch of things about the future, I imagine. And I know some of you will think, yeah, that's a bit far-fetched, it won't happen that fast. Well, you know, I referred to the McKinsey report. They reckon that something like 15% of vehicle sales by 2030 will be autonomous cars. Twice in the last 12 months I've been in an autonomous car. I spent 15 minutes with Simon Bridges in Tokyo last year, where we were sitting in the back seat of a Nissan. There was a guy sitting in the driver's seat, but he wasn't driving. He was just sitting there because they were required for regulatory purpose to be there. And admittedly, I made Simon Bridges a little nervous because I kept asking this guy questions while we were driving along. And he was turning around and talking to me while the car was changing lanes and overtaking other cars and so on. And when we got back to Nissan headquarters and talked about this car, they said that car will be on the showroom floor in 5 years, 2020. This year, GM are releasing a car that is capable of hands-free on the motorway. So these things are on the cusp, and all of the technology they need to do that is already in vehicles. The Google bit, and I've been to Google twice, the Google bit's a bit more sophisticated, but what Google say to us is they will have it cracked by 2025. They already have done 10 million kilometres of trialling. They have a better record than the average human driver. They say by 2025 they'll be ready to commercialise this. In the meantime, you've got Tesla and a range of others who say they're going to have stuff by 2020. But do you know what Google also say is that they don't reckon government's going to be ready for them? That it's going to take another 5 to 10 years for governments to get their heads around the regulatory frameworks. Which is why, right now, at the ministry, we've got a piece of work that I've commissioned called Regulation 2025. We're asking ourselves, 10 years from now, or 9 now, we're in 2016, what will the regulatory frameworks for all modes of transport need to be like if we're not going to be a barrier to these opportunities being seized by New Zealand? And even the mobility as a service thing, you know, getting your heads around that. We've just been doing a major review of the taxi, small passenger regulatory environment in New Zealand. If you think that's not happening, you've got to ask yourself, why does a company like General Motors spend $500 million investing in a company called Lyft, which is a rideshare company? When you go to Silicon Valley, all of the big car companies have a presence there now. They know their future is not in building cars and selling them. They know their future is in being a service provider, and that's why they're playing with big companies like Uber and Lyft. The other piece of work we're doing this year, which is forward-leaning around this stuff, is what we're calling Public Transport 2045. So at the moment, and the discussions I'm having with Auckland are still very much around a binary choice in world for mobility. You either have a private vehicle or you do public transport. But all of this stuff I'm talking about in mobility says there's a third option, which is mobility as a service, where you might do rideshare. And you don't own the vehicle, but it's not public transport as we know it. And I talked about the ITF study. So imagine a future where it's not a binary choice at the moment. There'll be a third option in there. So we're asking ourselves, what might that mean for public transport as we know it today? So look, that's a bit of a flavour of what we're thinking about as a ministry. As I said earlier, I know I won't have it completely right, but there you have some thoughts to at least provoke some further thinking. And let me just finish, and have we got sound? This is not going to do it, don't worry about that. So there you go, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Well done.